they let us be on the field all the time, right? Winning matters, and you have to be on the field to play, right? So the civil affairs teams engage every day here in the northern tier, which is, which has the most return on investment for us because these countries have the most room to grow compared to, say, something like Colombia or Brazil. So I think that's where, they let us be engaged every day, which is something we couldn't do before.
With Tesla Government's knowledge management solutions, you are adding a strategic partner that helps unleash the full power and potential of your institutional information. Let us unpack your data and put your knowledge to work. Learn more at teslagov.com.
Hi, and welcome to the 1CA podcast. I'm your host, John McElligott. The 1CA podcast is brought to you by the Civil Affairs Association. Our two guests today are U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Uherka. He is the Director of Civil Military Operations for Joint Task Force Bravo, Soto Cano Air Base, Honduras. In this capacity, he oversees and coordinates Directorate staff as well as 5 geographically separated civil affairs teams across the northern tier of Central America. He is a graduate of Southern Illinois University, go Salukis, and began his career as an officer in the infantry. As a civil affairs officer, he has experience in the Indo-Pacific, African, and South American regions. Other guest is U.S. Army Colonel Steve Berry. He is commander of Joint Task Force Bravo, Soto Cano Air Base, Honduras. He's responsible for a joint staff of nearly 1,200 soldiers, sailors, Marines, and civilians who coordinate and execute operations, activities, and investments for U.S. Southern Command in Central and South America. Colonel Berry is a graduate of West Point and Ohio State University, or should I say, sir, the Ohio State University, holding a PhD in history. He's an armor officer by trade and a self-described huge fan and public supporter of civil affairs operations. Gentlemen, welcome to the 1CA podcast.
Thanks for having us, John.
Appreciate it, John.
So we want to talk today about JTF Bravo and the Civil Affairs Company, but frame for listeners first what Joint Task Force Bravo normally deals with. So my first question to you, gentlemen, is what is the mission of Joint Task Force Bravo?
Yeah, so John, this is Steve Berry. So our mission is to, conduct operation activities and investments across mainly Central America. That's a focus of our joint operating area. We also are a contingency response force for Southcom, so we're forward positioned here at Soto Cano and prepared to deploy out of this airfield wherever they need us. So our operation activities investments center around global health engagements, civil affairs, and security cooperation. So that's generally what we do in a nutshell.
Roger. And what would you say is your joint operations area?
Sure. It's so CENTAM, as we call it, so Central America, so from the border of Guatemala and Mexico all the way down to the border of Panama and Colombia. And so that is where we focus most of our efforts. And then we are on tap, though, to episodically go throughout the Southcom area responsibility as needed, which obviously would include most of the Caribbean and South America. But we mainly focus from Panama to Guatemala. Roger.
So in connecting this to civil affairs, how would you say that civil affairs teams help to support JTF Bravo in the approach to, for example, countering illicit operations?
Yeah, John, this is Jeff Uherka. So, just a couple weeks ago, the National Defense University's National Strategic Studies published a report called MS-13 from Gang to Community Embedded Transnational Armed Group. And the premise of the article is that MS-13 has gone from a street gang in Central America to a competing governance capability to the governments in the northern tier. So a competing shadow governance, a competing shadow economy, and even a competing security force capability. And so how civil affairs looks at it is almost like a foreign internal defense, kind of like a counterinsurgency type of framework where we are doing operations, actions, and investments that bolster the key partners within key named areas of interest that have populations that are heavily influenced by these transnational criminal organizations. So the idea is to help the legitimate government be legitimized and build that trust of the populace so they call the police And so they participate and help the government in order to take away the influence, disrupt the influence, isolate the influence of the transnational criminal organizations, namely here in Honduras, MS-13.
Sir, would you say working by, with, and through the host country, but also any local indigenous organizations? Are there, for example, Guatemalan NGOs and other organizations that are non-governmental through which you work as well?
Absolutely. So, and you hit it well. So, corruption is a huge problem in Central America, or at least the perception of corruption. And so we see it at the higher levels of government. It's increased corruption. So at the lowest level, at the mayor level, at the local business level, that's where we have the best results. And Central America is saturated with non-governmental organizations. And so wherever there's that shared objectives, we definitely partner with them. A key initiative is the Denton Act, in which NGOs that are vetted by USAID help transport humanitarian aid through Central America, coming from space-safe flights from Charleston, South Carolina.
Wow. All right. So that means American aid coming through USAID flying into country from Charleston, and then they need to be local organizations that are pre-vetted that we trust, I guess, right, to be able to transport this stuff to get it to the right people.
That's right. So they're vetted by the USAID in Honduras, or whatever country the final destination is, and then we facilitate them coming into Soto Cano Air Base, picking up the cargo, and then transporting it. In fact, we just did a story from cradle to grave of the Denton Act of, as it lands here in Soto Cano, and then we kind of trace it as it moves to the NGO, and then the NGO to the hospital, and then the hospital to the actual patient that HA is actually being used for. That's
very cool. And sir, would you say that the CA teams involved with some of these operations, are they comprised, since you're a joint task force, is it Army and Marine Corps personnel, or since most CA personnel are Army, is it active only, for example, the 98th CA Battalion, or do you have reserve forces that rotate through as well?
So it's all Army, and I am the only regular Army civil affairs. So it's all, we are taking all reserve personnel with the short mobilization. We're bringing them here to Soto Cano, onboarding them. We have strong communication before they actually leave. We actually even go to their validation exercise, so that relationship starts maybe 60 days before they get here. Then we onboard them, and then we push them so they're persistently engaged, similar to an active duty like the 98th. They're persistently engaged in key locations across the northern tier.
Roger. You're in Honduras, Spanish-speaking country. Does that require that the personnel you receive speak Spanish, or can they speak English and get a translator?
Yeah, it's as you're probably aware, as civil affairs officer, it's always better to be able to speak Spanish. So every team has a fluent speaker, and then multiple teams have at least a 2-2. So fluent and then a 2-2 on the defense language proficiency test. And so, but there are some that do not speak any, and so that is a challenge we have, getting reservists who have a day job and are doing other things 9-10 months of the year. And so an initiative to kind of overcome that is a program through Southcom where we allocate money so that they, within the city that they are living in, whether it's Tegucigalpa or anywhere in Central America, an immersion program where like a civil affairs NCO who has no Spanish training will pay for them to do immersion training out of their team house. In fact, some of them are even doing it now via VTC because of the COVID threat. They're doing it, virtually. But they're spending 4 to 6 hours a day for about a month just focusing on their language so that they can conduct civil engagement at a higher level.
That's such a good resource. Gentlemen, how would you say that American interagency partners or regional partners and NGOs interact with the CA teams, and what's the value added of having CA teams on the ground interacting with these partners?
Yeah, so one of the initiatives here in Honduras, and it's actually through the northern tier, but Honduras is a good example. It's called the place-based strategy, and so it's civil affairs partnering with USAID and then INL. INL is the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement. And so this place-based strategy, we meet every other week, and the idea is how can we surge our capabilities and resources on their shared objectives. So the integrated country strategy for the Northern Tier is slightly different, but there's a shared objective. So, their number, 1, 2, and 3 priorities is stopping the impetus for migration, countering corruption, and then also stimulating the economy. But all those things also help us counter TCO influence. And so we find locations that are within our named areas of interest and within their focus areas, and then we layer our capabilities together. An example is in San Pedro Sula in the Rivera Hernandez neighborhood. It's a MS-13 stronghold. And so USID, with the deeper pockets, they have an initiative where they, within this neighborhood, work with the Ministry of Education and actually built a school. But then the Civil Affairs, working with the local police, use Humanitarian Assistance Program, or HAP, to create a security fence around the school so that kids can come in and out without the gang influence. And then an NFE, or non-federal agency, or NGO, provided funding for the actual computers that go into the school. So a layered response capability to counter TCOs for us, but then it also stops the impetus for migration for Department of State. It's all part of the place-based strategy.
It's good to hear that it works. Folks, you've been listening to an interview of the 1CA podcast with Army Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Uherka and Army Colonel Steve Berry. We're talking with Joint Task Force Bravo and Civil Affairs forces down in that area in Honduras. After the break, we'll speak with the gentleman about exercises in which the CA teams were employed and what makes CA teams successful in JTF Bravo. We'll be right back.
Everywhere you look, there's a barrage of emails and information telling you what everybody has done, is doing, or plans to do, all in excruciating detail. But access is only half the battle. You also need information presented in a usable form. But that takes work, and the more information you have, the more work it takes. Tesla Government takes on these issues so that your office or agency can fully exploit the data you already have. Our knowledge management experts organize and curate your internal data. Our open source research augments your knowledge base with strategic insights from our globally experienced team. And our data visualization turns complex data into compelling visuals, while our community building makes sure everyone benefits by leveraging collective knowledge. With Tesla Government's knowledge management solutions, you are adding a strategic partner that helps unleash the full power and potential of your institutional information. Let us unpack your data and put your knowledge to work. Learn more at teslagov.com.
Welcome back to the 1CA podcast and our guest today from Joint Task Force Bravo. Gentlemen, let's discuss the exercises in which CA teams were employed. These include Exercise Mercury in Panama. This was in December of 2019. And Exercise Vita in Colombia in March of 2020. Starting with Mercury, could you describe the concept and tell people how it played out?
Sure. So the overall concept is, Joint Task Force Bravo is Southcom's dynamic force employment, so we can go wherever it needs to go. So our tools at our disposal, we have our command and control, our civil affairs, our helicopters, our security forces, and our medical assets. And so we figured, how can we operationalize all these assets to build our partnerships, strengthen our partnerships across the region. So Mercury, we have about the ability to do 2 of these exercises a year, because during hurricane season we're sort of on call to respond to those contingencies. So our goal is to do 2 of these a year. So our first one was in Panama, Mercury, and that concept was to go to the Darien region, which is the southern portion of Panama, right next to Colombia, and we deployed most of our helicopter battalion and a portion of our civil affairs planning team that makes up part of our task force headquarters, what we call the SSAT, a Situation Awareness Team. And so the goal was to self-deploy out of Sotocano down to Panama, go to a remote region in the Darien, and then we actually went through a full command post exercise with a scenario where the Darien flooded, and how we would respond in partnership with COPECO, which is their disaster response FEMA equivalent down there, and other NGOs, and how we would deploy our CAT teams throughout the region to help bring relief. So that was the concept, to really test our command and control capability in an austere location and work with our Panamanian partners in a austere location. And then we evolved that to VITA in Colombia, where we brought a fourth of the task force down to Colombia. The goal of that was to go to La Guajira, which is a very remote region in Colombia with an indigenous population. And so our goal was to bring global health engagements, medical readiness exercise, and surgery exercises to those regions, and also establish a CMOC, it's the Military Operations Center, so we could work with their FEMA equivalent and other NGOs in that region. So they would go in and help facilitate these medical exercises, and also donate humanitarian assistance program supplies to each of the 4 villages we focused on in this remote region. In addition, they helped donate some key surgery equipment to a local hospital. We operated out of a Colombian Army base right near the Venezuelan border. And the civil affairs they're our key, contact layer, so to speak, with anywhere we go. And so, even though they're a recent addition to JTF Bravo, it's hard to imagine conducting any one of these exercises without that component. So I'll let Jeff add anything onto that. So.
Yeah, another unique situation with Colombia versus the Northern Tier in Central America is, in the Northern Tier, the civil affairs officer in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador is an additional duty. But in Colombia, they have their own professional full-time, it's a new capability, but they have their own civil affairs force. So it gave us an opportunity to work with their civil affairs, assess their ability, assess our interoperability, and determine, going forward, how can we improve that capability. So it initiated the relationship and initiated an assessment of Colombian civil affairs, which we were very impressed.
Gentlemen, thank you. Colonel Berry, for what you described and what was expected and some of the things delivered, was it what you expected? And what did you learn from the CA forces who were employed in those exercises?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I was pleasantly surprised with Exercise VITA that the response we got collectively from the Colombians, whether they're military or civil organizations, it was overwhelming, the support and willingness to help us pull off this exercise. And the civil affairs component to that, whether it's Jeff as J9 or our CAT teams, they were a key linkage that constantly stayed engaged with the Colombian civil affairs forces, but really, the rest of the civilian populace, and help coordinate whether it's a half donation or the medical exercise. So, down here in this part of the world, obviously it's much different than other AORs like CENTCOM, where we do a lot of indirectly counter, external state actors or transnational criminal organizations, and the civil affairs, I see their value every day here in the Northern Tier, but during a short exercise like that, they really help set the stage and create the excitement with our partner and willingness to support us. So I think that's my biggest takeaway from watching them work. And really, it was a strange environment for them. They're not persistently in Colombia, our teams. They quickly learn who the players were and really deliver results. So I was pleasantly surprised by that.
That's great news. And Colonel Ujerka, based on what had happened in Colombia and that country standing up some of their own CA forces, do you think that's a concept that would catch on? Do you think some of their neighbors would adopt CA as well?
So that's a great point. And with Colombia being such a strong partner to Southcom, that is a conversation we are bringing up with them is, how about we bring their civil affairs to the Northern Tier for a training exercise so they can see the value of a full-time professional civil affairs unit. So, how can we influence the Colombians to export their civil affairs to the Northern Tier? That's a great point. It's something that we are following up on.
Good deal. Colonel Barry, you mentioned something earlier about the SSAT, Southcom Situational Assess Team. Could you talk about what an SSAT is, what's its mission, and how does CA support that function?
Yeah, so Southcom has three of these teams, and then so do other combatant commands. Really what it is, think of it as a scalable operations center. So at any one time, we had 17 of our officers and NCOs on a 24-hour string to deploy out of Soto Cano to go anywhere Southcom needs us. So we can put on the ground a cross-functional team that can immediately set up communications and start to establish relationships wherever they need to go, whether responding to a disaster or some other crisis. You can imagine what those could be. And so the civil affairs is a key component to that. In fact, the leader of our SSAT team is a civil affairs officer. And, we see, that as being the core of the SSAT team is the civil affairs component, because anywhere we have to go, we have to first establish maps or the human terrain, the organizations we're going to have to work with. So it's really a team inside of so imagine my staff's about 100 people. So the SSAT is a part of that staff that is ready to go. And so we pick, our power players to do that. And they can land in a helicopter or a C-130, get out, set up communications, and start to build situational awareness for us so we can deploy the rest of the task force and obviously keep Southcom informed.
Gentlemen, I have two more questions for you today, and they're sort of tied together. Why do you think CA teams are successful in JTF Bravo? What do they have that makes them stand out, and what are some of the characteristics of the teams, the cats who have been successful in these rotations?
Hey, John, great question. I think we can answer that in two ways. One, civil affairs complements the mission, the Southcom mission here in the Northern Tier, and our interagencies integrated country strategy in the Northern Tier. So, as I stated earlier, our approach, our framework to countering TCOs, the indirect approach of strengthening our partnerships, and that also it provides shared objectives with USAID, Department of State, and then INL. So the mission state complements, but then also Joint Task Force Bravo, the core organic capabilities here complement civil affairs. So we have our own combat support hospital, and so they do medical readiness exercises, and so we integrate with them in the medical readiness exercises. We set the conditions, so key influencers are part of that exercise. When they leave the installation, they go to specific locations that have TCO influence. We also have the 228 Aviation Battalion, and that can power project us to areas where we couldn't go otherwise. We have a very talented PAO section that helps with our tactical and operational messaging. We have engineers that help us out with, so water insecurity is a huge problem in the Northern Tier, and so they help infrastructure, wells, to provide indigenous approach options to water insecurity. And so just the overall capabilities within Joint Task Force Bravo complement the civil affairs capability.
I would add to that they let us be on the field all the time, right? Winning matters, and you have to be on the field to play, right? So the civil affairs teams engage every day here in the Northern Tier, which has the most return on investment for us, because these countries have the most room to grow compared to, say, something like Colombia or Brazil. So I think that's where they let us be engaged every day, which is something we couldn't do before.
And gentlemen, my last question for you: do you have any parting recommendations for the CA forces listening about how they should train to be prepared for operating at this high level at which JTF Bravo currently operates? And what skills should the CA forces hone to be ready for adversaries, the people that you're battling in different ways?
Yeah, John, great question. So first of all, why reserve civil affairs is value added, and the answer is their civilian jobs. So we have civil affairs team members that work for USAID. They're advisors for Congress. We have an FBI agent. We have lawyers. And so we're able to use all these skills and apply it to building, strengthening partnerships and countering threats. So it's that unique skill set that we cannot get in the regular Army. But, I would have to say special operations, truth number one is humans are more important than hardware. And so the most important thing is studying the operational environment. So knowing the language, knowing the socioeconomic and political history of the area, understanding political and economic warfare and how to operationalize the political and economic variable, because our opponents are doing it, so we have to understand it as well. And then I would say, in regards to civil reconnaissance and civil information management, having a network kind of perspective. So, it's you're looking at building friendly networks that can then defeat enemy networks, and being able to identify key influencers and then engage them and influence them. So, negotiation skills, influential skills. And then in order to reduce the risk of force, what we're seeing is that, the highest risk here in the northern tier is driving, because they're doing engagements in austere rural locations that are undergoverned. So having training that focuses on a vehicle rollover accident and the medic's got to treat the patient, someone's got to drive the vehicle, and someone's calling the surgeon on the medications as they're moving to a CASEVAC location. So collective drivers medical training in order to reduce the risk of force are some of the key training aspects.
Yeah, I would reemphasize that what keeps me up at night is these four-man, CAT teams we have that are alone and unafraid sometimes in these cities where there's high crime rates and bad drivers, and we ask them to do a lot to set the stage for us. So individuals sort of taking that ownership of, have I done everything I can to be ready before I deploy? We obviously, the reserves make up the bulk of our civil affairs force, and a lot of the onus is on that individual to be ready to go. So I couldn't agree more with what Jeff just said. So we can keep the risk down and keep these guys, active throughout the JOA.
Exactly. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for being here. Our guests today have been Army Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Uherka and Army Colonel Steve Barry. They're with Joint Task Force Bravo, and today we've been talking about JTF Bravo and the connection to civil affairs. Gentlemen, thank you for being on the 1CA podcast.
Our pleasure. Thank you, John.
Check out the Civil Affairs Call for Issue papers. The deadline to submit a paper is August 28th. Civil Affairs can find better integration as a force for influence, collaboration, and competition for convergent threats and challenges for multi-domain and information operations, now called Joint All-Domain Operations. As the nation's warrior diplomats, the CA Corps must modernize, especially for gray zone competition, and foster a learning organization. It must reinforce supported command understanding of CA Corps competencies and capabilities at tactical and operational levels. It must seize opportunities to be a greater force for influence through national strategic initiatives like the Stabilization Assistance Review and the Global Engagement Center. And it must help build an industrial base in applied social sciences and related technologies. The Civil Affairs Association and its partners invite civil military professionals to submit originally written issue papers. The deadline is August 28th. For more information, including paper guidelines, visit Civil Affairs, all one word, ASSOC.org.
Thank you for spending some time with us. Please subscribe and come back for another installment of 1CA. Until then, be safe and secure the victory.